Sometime in the summer of 1933, a boy of 14 left a note on the kitchen table of a house he had lived in all his life, walked out the door before anyone was awake, and made his way down to the railroad yard on the edge of town. He was not running away from a cruel home. He loved his mother and his father. He left because there were 6 people at that table and food enough for 4, and he had worked out, the way a child does when he is trying to be a man too soon, that if he was gone, the ones he loved would eat a little more. He was one of hundreds of thousands of American children who did exactly this, and what happened to them on those trains is one of the hardest, least remembered stories of the Great Depression. They didn't have much, but they knew how to make it last. We do not know the true number, and we never will. But by the middle of the 1930s, historians and the railroads themselves estimated that something like 250,000 young people were riding the freight trains of America. They were boys mostly, some as young as 12 and 13, and there were girls among them too, often cutting their hair short and wearing their brothers' clothes for safety. They came from farms swallowed by dust, from mill towns where the mill had closed, from city apartments where the rent had come due 1 month too many. Almost none of them were running from a bad family. Nearly all of them were running from a table with too many mouths at it, and they left believing they were doing the only useful thing left to do. Life on the rails was a strange, hard education, and it had rules. The children learned to wait in the brush outside the yard, because a boy standing on the platform was a boy who would be caught. They learned to catch a freight car as the train pulled slowly out of the yard, and never, ever when it was moving with any speed. They learned which cars gave shelter from rain and which would freeze you at altitude. And they learned to fear the railroad police, whom they called the bulls, men paid to keep the trains clear, some of whom simply turned a boy out at the next stop, and some of whom did not, and beat him badly first. Every rule these children learned, they learned because someone before them had learned it the hard way. They found each other in the camps by the tracks, the settlements the riders called jungles, where a pot of thin stew was kept going by whoever had something to put in it. There, a boy of 14 sat among grown men who had lost everything, and among other children just like himself, and he was fed and warned and taught. There were marks scratched on fence posts and gateways all across the country, a whole quiet language of signs that told a rider which house would give a meal for a chore, which town jailed strangers on sight, and where a dog would come at you. Hungry children knocked on back doors and offered to chop wood or haul water in exchange for a plate, and a great many American housewives fed a boy on the back step and asked no questions, because she had a son of her own, and God only knew where he might be. Now, before this goes any further, I want you to sit with the question these families lived with, because it is a terrible one. If you had 4 children and food for 2, and your oldest boy came to you and said he would leave so the little ones could eat, what would you say to him? And if you were that boy, 14 years old, watching your family go hungry, would you have the courage or the recklessness to walk out the door and take your chances on a train? Write your honest answer in the comments right now, before you read on. Then keep going, because the price these children paid was far higher than most people today have any idea of. Because here is the part of this story that must not be softened. The railroads were dangerous beyond anything these children understood when they started. A boy who slipped while catching a moving car went under the wheels, and the trains did not stop. Riders froze in the mountain passes and were found in the cars at the end of the line. They fell from the tops of boxcars while asleep. They were maimed, losing a leg or an arm, and lived out their lives that way. The railroads recorded thousands of deaths and injuries among people riding illegally in those years, and a heartbreaking share of them were young. For every boy who came home with a story, there were others whose families simply never heard from them again and never learned what had happened, and waited for the rest of their lives. And the road was not only dangerous because of the trains. A child alone on the road in those years was a child among strangers, some kind, some very much not. There was hunger that lasted for days. There were nights in a locked jail cell because a town had decided that a hungry boy was a problem to be removed. There was cold and sickness with no one to nurse you, and a loneliness that the men in the camps remembered in these children long after. By 1933, the government understood the scale of it well enough to set up shelters and camps meant to get these young people off the rails and fed, and they helped a great many. But there were always more children on the trains than there were beds waiting for them. So, what became of that boy of 14 who left a note on the table in the summer of 1933? For a great many like him, the ending was this. He rode for a season or a year. He took what work he could find, a day in the fields, a week in a mill, and he sent money home when he had any to send. And one day, when things at home had eased just enough, he came back, older and thinner and quieter, and his mother held on to him for a long time and never quite let him out of her sight again. But that was not every ending, and we should not pretend it was. Some of those children came home broken in body. Some came home in a way that never really let them settle again. And some never came home at all and became a name a family spoke less and less often over the years because it hurt too much to say it. That is the true weight of it. When we talk about the toughness of that generation, this is part of what we are talking about. Children who took on the burden of an entire family's hunger and carried it out the door on their own small shoulders. There was extraordinary courage in them, and resourcefulness, and a loyalty to the people they loved that ought to stop us in our tracks. There was also terrible danger, and real suffering, and losses that families carried in silence for 50 years afterward. No child should ever have to choose between a hungry family and a freight train. That so many did is not a charming story about a tougher time. It is a measure of just how hard those years truly were. They were the hard years. They didn't have much, but they knew how to make it last. And that's worth remembering. If someone in your family rode the rails in those years, or left home young so the others could eat, tell me in the comments. Their names deserve to be spoken. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because every week we go back inside the hardest years America ever faced, and the quiet courage of the people who lived through them.